Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show veteran firefighter paramedic, flight medic, and author of multiple books, Kevin Grange. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into the world of EMS, his training at the Daniel Freeman Paramedic School, writing his first book, Lights and Sirens, transitioning to becoming a first responder in the national parks, grizzly bear attacks, bison gorings, some notable rescues, mental health, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Kevin Grange. Enjoy. Well, Kevin, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thanks, James. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Likewise. So very first question, where on planet Earth are we finding you this afternoon?
Sure. I'm currently living in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with my wife, Megan, who is also a firefighter paramedic. And it's kind of a mild winter snow-wise, so we're already having a couple wildland fires going off and just getting ready for the busy summer season out here.
A lot of people that I know that are in ski areas are reporting the same thing. Is it unusual to have this little snow at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. I think, typically we think of wildfire season kicking in around August, but, already it's May and there's been a couple fires from lightning strikes. So we're just, kind of getting ready for a busy summer season.
I'm jumping way ahead, obviously, to pretty much your role now, but it's interesting how politically the whole global warming thing is, one way or the other. But there has been a common denominator in the wildland firefighter guests that I've had that are all saying, oh, no, this is a real thing. Like this is getting worse and worse every year. What are you seeing through your eyes?
I think it is. And, we used to talk of like a wildfire season, but now it's year round, basically. And these teams are deploying year round to, maybe it's the South this part of the year, maybe it's Texas, maybe it's, Pacific Northwest, but yeah, it is a year round thing. And just the trends, like it'll be 80 here one day and then the next day it's snowing. So it's just the size of the storms and the climate variability. So I definitely think it's a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like most real issues in the world, they're not political. They're a human issue, or an environmental issue. So it shouldn't be politicized in the first place.
Exactly.
All right. Well, let's start at the very beginning of your journey then. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Sure. I was born in Chicago and then we moved to New Hampshire when I was in third grade. So I really think of myself as having grown up in New Hampshire, and I was the youngest of three. And my mom stayed home with us for a lot of years. And then she was also like a special ed teacher. And then my dad worked for a software company. And, they raised us just to be outdoors as much as we can and, would go to church on Sundays. And they really did raise us to just have that mindset of like helping others and community service. And so I think what I'm doing now was kind of built into me early on, thanks to my parents.
Have you had any conversations with your mum about the evolution of, I don't know if it's special ed or maybe more of the, the special needs community, but we've seen such a beautiful metamorphosis from a long time ago where people that had, learning challenges or developmental issues that were literally institutionalized. And now we're seeing people with Down syndrome running, Ironman triathlon. So has she seen kind of what's going on as far as the progression in that field?
Yeah, she definitely has. And it's been amazing and it's inspiring. And, I have a cousin who has Down syndrome and he is just like the coolest guy and, works a couple different jobs. And he's had a girlfriend, since I think they're probably like 9 or 10 years old. And, he came out to Jackson Hole a couple weeks ago and I showed him, the fire station and the helicopter. And, I think previously we put limits on people with special needs, but now we're sort of, they can rise to the challenge and they can exceed all of our expectations. So it's just a different mindset for sure.
Where do you think your parents got this compassion, this empathy, this sense of service where, it's not really touted at the moment these days?
I think they were both raised Catholic, and I think through the church, their parents raised them to help others, and whether that's working, handing out a Thanksgiving meal or Meals on Wheels, delivering meals to elderly folks, or donating clothes. I think they were raised that way, and they raised us that way. And then I think for myself, I think we were put here on earth to serve others. And that's, what makes you ultimately happiest. And so I try to just live a life of service through my work, through community service. And then even my writing, I see as like a service. I'm sharing these stories and I'm celebrating others and celebrating the work that they do.
Love it. What about exercise and sports? What were you playing and doing throughout the school ages?
Yeah, great question. I think if you want to work in the fire service, having grown up playing sports is huge, just because it is both endeavors are team based, and so learning how to work as part of a team towards a common goal is huge. And also just having a coach, and I grew up playing basketball, baseball, and soccer, whereas in the fire service, your coach is sort of like your coach or your battalion chief. So learning how to take constructive criticism and put that into action. And so, yeah, from the beginning, I was, soccer in the fall, basketball in the winter, baseball in the spring. And towards the end of high school, I sort of prioritized basketball and was hoping to play in college, but then got injured my senior year. So just did intramurals throughout college.
What was the injury that you had?
It was sort of just like tendonitis and knee pain. And then I just kept spraining my ankle. I know you studied some exercise physiology. So I had these ankles that just kept getting sprained and re-sprained. And, once you have that fear of pain, you begin to play tentatively. So your game changes. And so, I still love the sport and I still play here and there. But, I think the lessons I learned from playing sports have helped me in the medical field. Maybe it's like you miss a shot in basketball, kind of like you miss an IV. You can't be dwelling on the past. You got to just move forward, compartmentalize, and, get that next IV type of thing.
You have a lot of experience in this field. IV bad days, myth or reality?
I think it's more of a myth. I think some patients are more challenging. Maybe they don't, they have veins that you can see, but they don't have the bounce, or maybe they have valves. But, what I try to do is I practice like no ego medical care. And so I don't have an ego about it. And, I'll try once or twice and then I'll, invite my partner to try, whatever's best for the patient. And, that's how it is. But probably some days you're maybe a little off on your game. But when I teach IVs, I always tell folks, the patient knows best. So when you're having trouble finding that vein, just ask the patient, hey, where do they normally get you? And they'll steer you right to their best vein. So that's one good way to kind of solve that problem.
It's interesting you say that, because that's exactly what I found as well. And I didn't have a long time. I became a medic a little later on, not any other reason than I kept moving departments and kind of resetting the clock. But I'd usually give it a couple of sticks, and then exactly like you said, all right, obviously I'm not hitting it today. Is there anyone that you see on your side you want to give it a go? But you'd see some of the guys, and the poor patient has got 6, cotton buds taped down where they've missed all these things. And, again, as you alluded to, a lot of the patients do know best. They know every med they take down to the milligrams and the frequency. So yeah, they're going to tell you, hey, you can't get me on my wrist. Try this, right AC or whatever it is. And you have to be humble enough to listen sometimes.
Yeah. And then maybe it's humble enough to say, I can't place this 18 gauge. I'm going to go smaller with the 22, and maybe you get that first IV, you can give them fluid to perk up the other veins and then place that 18 or whatever it is. But one thing we've done here too is, on the critical patients, we have sort of this mantra of like, 2 IV attempts and then drill and get that IO. And we kind of put that into practice because we had a critical patient probably about 10 years ago. And you want to start that IV and you get tunnel vision. And I was driving, so I wasn't in the back, but they attempted 7 IVs on this patient, all without success. And the patient was super critical. And, after that, we're just like, hey, 2 attempts and then just go right to that IO on those critical patients that are crashing.
Are you hitting the humeral IOs these days?
I am, yeah. And that's, I work for Air Idaho Rescue, and they're really big on the humeral IO just because you can infuse fluid a lot faster. It's kind of closer to the heart. And a lot of folks, you're supposed to bend the elbow. And so they like, well, what if we're doing CPR? You got the Lucas there. But if you look on YouTube, there's also like you extend the arm and you kind of do a thumb towards the bum. And that'll get you the same sort of rotation. So you can have the patient's arm straight with that thumb down towards the bum to get that same landmark.
Brilliant. I'm glad I asked that question. All right. What about career aspirations then? Were you thinking of fire and EMS when you were in high school, or was there something else in your mind back then?
Well, ideally, I would have been, getting ready to play for the Boston Celtics, but I stopped growing at like 5'11" and couldn't really jump. And I had those knee injuries and those ankle injuries. So I graduated from Seattle University, and I've always been a writer. And so I was trying to make it as a screenwriter and having jobs that sort of supported my love of writing. And so I found myself in my 30s, I think similar to you, we kind of found our way into the fire service a little bit later. And I was working in real estate and I enjoyed it, but I wanted to help people in a more meaningful and direct way. And I kind of looked back on my life, and what I tell people when they're thinking about what they should do is kind of like a hazmat, have a wide perimeter that you can shrink instead of, it's always easier to shrink that perimeter. So instead of looking for the profession, think of like what aspects you want. And so I wanted something that was team-based, every day was different, kind of physical. I like to be on my feet, a job that blended critical thinking with practical skills. And then, so I thought of that. And then I remember like the job that I loved the most was as a lifeguard in high school, and so it's like, it's like a first responder. And so from that realization, I took an EMT class, and then I felt like I'd found my tribe, and I just loved, pre-hospital medicine. And then that kind of took me into paramedic school, which I started at age 36. So, there was I think a 19-year-old in my class. So I was sort of like the old guy, but I think by then I'd had a lot of life experience. So you can really relate to every type of patient. because you've encountered them before. And so I think, maybe I'm a little bit older and the 24-hour shifts hit me harder, but then I have that life experience to connect with each and every patient.
What were you lifeguarding on? Was it pools, open water, ocean?
It was a water slide park, like in New Hampshire, called Water Country, and so I was working the lazy river, and it was kind of funny that people would fall off their inner tube or whatever and start to panic, and I'd just be like, "Stand up." Then they'd realize they could actually stand, and then, but we had some like trip and falls, some head injuries and some allergic reactions, and it kind of just gave me a flavor for working as a first responder. And then once I took my EMT class, then I sort of zeroed in on the fire service. So no one in my family had really done it, but I was the first. And then my brother's since become an EMT, and he does ski patrol. And like I said, my wife's a firefighter paramedic. So I have obviously a close family and also like the fire service family. So definitely blessed.
I lifeguarded for a while too, and it was initially just in a local pool, and then it was summer camps on lakes, and then a water park as well. And when I reflect back now, I can remember being bored and just wishing someone would drown so I could do something, which I don't think you're supposed to be wishing for. But
Yeah.
and that was what was nice about the fire service is like, all right, we're just gonna train and work out and be in the station. When you have an emergency, give us a call. Versus obviously, lifeguarding really is prevention, isn't it? But I do
Yeah,
remember
exactly.
kind of, wishing someone would get in trouble just so we could jump in and do something, reactive as well.
Yeah, and some of those jobs in some ways I think are harder than being a paramedic. Like my brother was doing some event medicine. He was an EMT at, Snoop Dogg concerts, and he's just out there by himself, with minimal gear. And there's other EMTs, but it takes them a while to get to him. So, it's loud, he can't hear thousands of people. So I kind of joke that it's like I have the easy job because I got my ambulance, it's well lit, I've got all the supplies I need, I got my crew of 6 on scene with me. So some of those jobs, lifeguard, EMT at concerts, they can be like deceptively challenging that, people don't always realize how hard that can be.
I was just at Welcome to Rockville, which is a metal festival basically, and during the couple of days that we were there, a woman was punched in the face in the mosh pit deliberately. The guy was just going around punching people. There was someone else who sprayed mace into the audience. So, yeah, seeing
Yes.
these poor crews trying to navigate. There was 50,000 people there every day. I
Right.
can't imagine how hard that must have been.
Yeah, for sure.
So EMT school, did you go into that with the view of becoming a firefighter specifically? Was there a time in fire, or did you go from EMT straight to medic school?
I took my EMT. I was living in Park City at the time and working on my first book. And I became an EMT, and then I worked at Park City Mountain Resort as like a summer EMT on the mountain. And so I had like visions of doing these mountain bike crashes and all these things. And it turns out I was just mainly loading the Alpine slide all day. And occasionally, someone would crash on the slide, I would help. So I mainly wasn't really working as an EMT, but I did that. And then I worked in a primary care doctor's office. And so that was good, just checking people in, taking their vital signs, getting their chief complaint. So I did that for a couple years. And they pretty much let me do anything I wanted. Like I was taking x-rays, which is kind of just punching numbers into the machine, removing stitches, just assisting with a lot of different medical procedures. And then from there, I went to Los Angeles to go to UCLA's paramedic program. And I guess it was there that there was a bunch of sponsored guys from, LA, LAFD and Santa Monica Fire. And so meeting them and hearing their stories and then doing my field internship with LAFD really sort of solidified my dream to join a fire department.
So talk to me about why you found yourself at that specific paramedic school, and then talk to me about the level of training that you were getting there specifically.
Sure. I chose UCLA because it has a great reputation. It was one of the first paramedic programs in the country. And I wasn't quite sure where I would end up living. And so I wanted a program that was well known. So, if I decided to move to Seattle or something, that they would kind of know what program I went through. And then I also wanted to work in a city where I could just see all types of calls, meet all types of patients, just see it all, because a lot of this job is seeing something once and then you can recognize it the second time, sort of that like pattern recognition. Um, and then I had family in the Southern California area. So that's sort of how I chose UCLA. And, it was intense. I did the full-time program. So we were there Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning till 5 at night. And then we'd have like quizzes every day and, block exams. So it was easily the most stressful educational experience I'd ever had, but it was also the most rewarding. And, stuff I learned back then is just still within me. And, it was just a great education. So definitely thankful for that.
Were you doing that full time or having to work on the side?
I was doing that full time. So I saved up some money and, my parents helped me out a little bit and just, yeah, committed full time. And, sometimes I get emails from people who are about to go to paramedic school. And one of the things I tell them is like, set yourself up to succeed. And so a lot of the folks that failed out of my class, they were trying to do too many things. They were trying to work too much on the side and, go to school full time. And so it wasn't necessarily that they weren't going to be great paramedics. They just didn't set themselves up to succeed. So maybe like a part-time program would have worked better or, something like that. So I just committed full time, yeah, to, weekend studying and every night studying till 9 or 10 p.m. and just up early. So that's kind of what it took. But I think that full immersion allowed the education just to sink in at a really deep level.
When I went through school, and I agree, it was the hardest year of my life. I was still working full time on a super busy rescue, driving 70 miles to go to school, which is where I lived. And then, so school, 9 hours that day, 12-hour clinical the next day, rinse and repeat, shift. But I was also going through divorce and was a single dad. So I genuinely, hand on my heart, look back and go, I don't know how I did it. Like, I really don't. And that's not like patting myself on the back. Like, logistically, I don't know how we made it work. But I think obviously with babysitters and, all these other things, trying to get everyone taking care of my son when I had to be away. But yeah, I mean, it was absolutely brutal. I don't think people realize, unless they're given everything by their department and they can ride with their department, they're paid and all that stuff, that's different. But if you're doing it on your own on the side and you're working as a firefighter, kudos to you, because it takes every single moment that you have for that solid year.
Yeah, it does for sure. And one thing I tell people is if you're motivated and you care, you can go to pretty much most any program and you'll be a great paramedic. Or you could have someone who doesn't care and is not invested. They could go to the best program and emerge a decent paramedic. So I think if people have that drive and initiative, they don't have to go to necessarily like a UCLA. They'll become great paramedics, and if they choose good mentors afterwards, so that's important to realize.
Had you already decided to write to Lights and Sirens as you went along, or were you kind of journaling as you were going through? What was the timeline of the book compared to your medic training?
Yeah, I think definitely was not planning to write the book, and I just take notes. Like, that's how I listen, so when I listen to one of your podcasts, I'm just taking notes because that kind of just imprints it into me. And so during school, I was just taking a ton of notes. And if someone would make a funny comment, I would jot that down too. And I think it was a year or two after school that I had the idea. And I read, previously I thought considered law school, like when I was in high school, and I read this book called 1L, and it was about this guy's first year at Harvard Law School. And so that kind of got me thinking, and I'm like, there's no book about paramedic school. And people know what paramedics do, they save lives, but they don't really know like how they do it or how they're educated to do it. And so that's sort of how I got the idea for the book. And definitely going to school in Los Angeles, I think helped just because, it's the city has a reputation and, it's kind of like the birthplace of gangster rap and the LA riots. And it's a dramatic place just by the name. So I think the school and the location helped sell the book. And then I guess another thing, the writer in me, school had like a natural 3-act structure. You start in the classroom, then you do your clinical rotations, then you do your field internship. And so it's kind of 3 acts, but also kind of rising in stakes and drama, so you go from the classroom all the way to ending up in the field. So that sort of made writing it a little bit easier.
I can't remember if we talked about this before, but I just had John Moon on the show talking about the origin of the paramedic program, which was not what I was told when I was in school. I was told it was Florida and LA, and it turns out it was Pittsburgh. Were you given any of that Freedom House history when you were in LA, or was it kind of the kind of LA origin story that a lot of us were told?
Definitely the LA origin story, but our textbook was Nancy Caroline's textbook. So we got a little bit of the Pittsburgh history and the Miami history. But I think maybe not to the extent that your podcast, revealed, or Kevin Hazard's book, American Sirens, so I'm glad that there is that awareness now that it really did begin in Pittsburgh with the Freedom House, and to me, that's just a great story, and I think it would be an amazing movie, and definitely inspiring.
Absolutely. Well, you were in New Hampshire growing up, like you said. You're in some of these EMT positions and lifeguard positions, but not seeing a lot going on. When I've left, rural England, a farm boy, and then I find myself in Hialeah outside Miami working as a firefighter, and then Anaheim with all the gangs that they have there. It was a bit of a culture shock at first. It was not, the arena that I'd grown up in. I wasn't in Compton, for example. So what parts of LA did you find yourself working in as far as, through medic school? And then what was some of the aha moments of some of these more desperate populations that a lot of us are naive to?
Yeah, well, I did my clinical shifts at a hospital in downtown Los Angeles called California Hospital. And, there it's like you walk through a metal detector just to get into the waiting room. And so I think that just opened my eyes to just all different types of patients, all different socioeconomic levels and all different life experiences. And, just learning to make that connection with people whose background is definitely different than yours. So that's just like great experience, and, physically different too, so just doing the procedures, finding IVs, just everything was different based on which patient you were treating. So that's just amazing experience. And then I did my field internship with Fire Station 38 out of Wilmington, Los Angeles, which is in the harbor. So kind of near Long Beach down there. And my station didn't have it wasn't running 24/7, but they got some really good calls. And so I think day one, I showed up at 7 and we had a shooting by 10 a.m. It's like, who shoots someone at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning? It's just, but as it happens around the clock. And so that was a good station in that the calls were generally all critical. It's like in that neighborhood, if they called 911, they definitely needed you, which is different than other stations where, like Station 9 for LAFD, it's right there in Skid Row, and, they'll leave the house in the morning with the ambulance and probably don't get back to the station until shift change, just running and gunning the whole time. And some of it's just people need a ride to the hospital or don't have a primary care doctor. But then, of course, there's the critical patients. And, so it's almost like two different jobs based on what station. And even, working as a firefighter paramedic in Jackson Hole versus Los Angeles, it's the same profession, but it's almost like two different professions. Most houses here are 2 stories tops, maybe 3 stories, which is different than fighting fire on the high rises or big, huge commercial structures. So we have our challenges out here, but those city guys just, I definitely tip my hat to them and everything they do. And, just they do amazing.
This is what's crazy because, I mean, their core volume is insane. In a lot of cities, core volume is insane. But, the West Coast has some really, really high call rates. And, I've talked about the work week for a long, long time now. And our, West Coast men and women are so woefully understaffed. And LAFD, I mean, is horrendous at the moment. I saw an article probably about 6 months ago now where it reported that LAFT's overtime budget, not their budget, their overtime budget was $1.2 billion for the last 4 years, 1.2 billion with a B. And that just goes to show, I mean, every one of those hours is someone working when they shouldn't be working, so
sure.
The understaffing, the mandatory overtime, and it's killing them. It's absolutely killing them. We are seeing a revolution now in Florida where departments are realizing that the way you fix the bleeding is that you proactively invest in your men and women. You create a good work week. Now people want to come work for you. Now that fills the vacancies, and a 4-shift system, 24/72. And where there's the snowball is rolling now. It's happening here. And I hope to God it will then make its way to the West Coast, because I can't think of an area of the country that needs it more than them. I've got friends that have worked like 120s, 5 days straight, which is, irresponsible, unprofessional, and unethical, especially when these men and women are being forced to work it.
Yeah. And then sometimes you don't know the effects of working it until down the road, and some of my friends with like LA County or LA City, they retire and they just find that they can't sleep through the night anymore. And, so you don't always know how it's affecting you until later. And, so I love this idea of just finding that good work-life balance, like you say, and maybe it's 24/72 or, out here, the 48/96 works really well because we're not running and gunning all night. And, some people commute for, 2 or 3 hours to work. But yeah, I think each place has to find their own answers.
Yeah. Well, the 48/96 is still a 56-hour work week. So this is the thing. The 42-hour work week, I think, should be an industry standard, because that's still, at most 2 commutes a week, so, then you get that 72-hour period to reset. When you look back at that portion of your career, what were some of the career calls that you remember?
I think, an internship, I look back and I kind of cringe at like how bad I was, but I was more just new. And I think my 2 preceptors were great. One was kind of like a laid back surfer, and he just taught me like how to be grounded on scene, no matter what's going on. And then the other one was kind of high strung. And he really taught me how to like pick up the momentum on a scene, and stuff really needs to happen fast. And so I feel like thanks to them, I can balance those 2 energies. And you've probably seen it, like sometimes you walk in and the patient's just like circling the drain and stuff's got to happen super fast, so I've got that energy from one, and other times it's a chaotic scene and you got to just bring that calm presence and that grounding. But for internship, I made a lot of mistakes, but I didn't make them twice. And I think I was like teachable, which they really liked. I kept a little notebook with me and would write down all the advice. And then what they told me is they could tell me something and then they'd see it on the next call. So was really thankful that they were, open to precepting me. And yeah, I think it started, the first day with that shooting. I know on that one, I forgot to look for the exit wound. And then there was like a double stabbing that we had. Um, the thing with the city, having left LA to work in a national park, you know, you run a lot of calls, but you generally arrive with a lot of resources and you're surrounded by hospitals. So, you can kind of swoop in, scoop up the patient and get going. And so some of my more dramatic calls have been out here in Jackson Hole and with the National Park Service, where, it might take you an hour to get to the patient, you know, so that whole golden hour is already gone because you don't even arrive at the patient within 60 minutes, let alone get them to the hospital. And then generally, like the resources are a lot less. There might only be two or three of you on scene, and the transport times to the hospitals could be 1 hour to 3 or 4 hours, based on where you want to go. So I think the most dramatic calls have been after I left Los Angeles, kind of dealing with that wilderness medicine and remote medicine.
Well, let's bridge that gap then. So how did you find yourself from a densely populated urban setting to the national parks?
Yeah. So I graduated from UCLA in 2011. And at the time, everyone wanted to be a firefighter. And so I applied to LAFD, and I think there was 11,000 applicants, Pasadena, 3,000, Santa Monica, 5,000. So I wasn't getting hired, and I was working for an IFT company based out of Compton, actually. So doing, those IFTs, interfacility transports, and, they say, I forget, being crazy is doing the same thing that's not working and not changing anything, or however that quote goes. And so I just wasn't getting hired. And I thought, I really should change something, whether it's, my geographical area. And I was camping in Yosemite with my parents, and I saw an ambulance, and like a light bulb clicked. And, I didn't even, it seems obvious that national parks would have paramedics, but at the time I hadn't really thought of it. And so I saw that, and I realized I could merge my two passions, which are medicine and the outdoors. And so I applied to work in Yellowstone. To do that, you go through usajobs.gov. And it took a couple hiring rounds, but I eventually got hired to work as a summer paramedic at Old Faithful in Yellowstone. And then did that for 2 summers and spent about 6 months in Yosemite in California, and then a couple summers at Grand Teton, and then I got hired full-time with Jackson Hole Fire EMS.
Going back for a second, when you're trying to get hired by FD, were you already an academy certified firefighter, or were you still single cert medic at that time?
I was just a paramedic. And so I think my application, even though some of those bigger departments, they'll put you through their training academy, I think they might not, I think if you really want to get hired, get your EMT and get your fire academy cert, and you'll get picked up pretty quick. And if you have a paramedic and your fire academy, even quicker. So I think, I didn't have the fire academy. And so I think that kind of hurt me at the time. But then through the national park, I was hired as a paramedic, but then they put me through their structured fire academy. And then I was able to get hired.
Because you're talking about 2011. I've said this many, many times. That's how competitive it was up till probably just 10 years ago. And there's such again, going back to LA, there's such a recruitment and retention crisis at the moment. And there's no discussion of how do we get from testing against thousands of people. Like Anaheim, I tested against, I did the written against 1,000 people, and there was 15 jobs for that first class, 15 in the class behind me. And that's how competitive it was. You're talking about the top 3% of a list, those two classes combined. Sure. And now you've got departments, offering hiring bonuses and begging high school kids to come do the job because they're so desperate. And I think it's a really important conversation. It wasn't that long ago that everything was very competitive, but we refused to change. And insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. That's it. That's what we did. we're losing people to cancer and suicide and all these things with divorces and alcoholism. And we're just shrugging our shoulders and going, well, I don't know. And then it got to the point where it affected our retention. It affected our recruitment. And now we're seeing the solutions, and not just the work week, but great mental health tools. And I know we're going to get to peer support in a bit. There are answers to these questions now. And so, we're able to turn this around. But people say, oh, we're just trying to take firefighters from other departments. And it's like, no, the rising tide lifts all ship. We're trying to re-stimulate this profession to how it used to be. And if you talk even back in the 80s, how competitive it was, the 90s, and I came on early 2000s. So it's always an important conversation when someone has been hired 10 plus years ago, for them to tell the story of how damn competitive it was to be a paramedic or a firefighter or both, when everyone else wanted to, and their resumes were fat trying to get that experience where they would be able to turn the heads of a recruiter and actually get one of those coveted positions.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you take the written exam at like LA Convention Center, and it wasn't, the written exam wasn't in a classroom. It was in huge convention centers and arenas, basically. And, you'd see the line of applicants around the block, everyone wearing a suit and tie. So yeah, that's how it was in 2011 for sure. But yeah, you make
Absolutely.
a lot of good points about then versus now, and what needs to change, but what hasn't changed. And I do love this quote: firefighters hate two things: change and the way things are. But yeah, I do think a lot of things need to change, and we have the answers. It's just a matter of, do we want to apply them?
Absolutely. I think we need to change that quote to firefighters should hate firefighters that hate change.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So you have, again, this urban experience in LA. As you start doing these seasonal jobs, talk to me about the idiosyncrasies of this profession in the national parks, because I'm sure most people listening, myself included, we're pretty much oblivious to this role in this particular setting.
Sure. Well, at Old Faithful, the closest hospital was 2 hours away, and the closest level 2 trauma center was 3.5 hours away. And the closest level 1 was in Salt Lake, which is like 5 hours away. And so I came from LA, where there's a lot of resources on scene. You're surrounded by hospitals, short transport times to Old Faithful, this iconic national park, where many times it would just be me driving the ambulance by myself. I drive to the scene, and then law enforcement park rangers, who are also paramedics or EMTs, would show up on scene and meet me there. And then, as far as who would drive the ambulance, we'd have a lot of like volunteer drivers, like retirees, who would offer. So it's sort of like an all hands on deck. And I guess I learned to really run calls with limited resources. So like how to put bystanders to work to help run this call, or family members if there weren't any Park Service folks around. Like what treatments, how do you triage your treatments? Like what needs to be done right now? What can wait a little bit? And then just always having a backup plan. I love this quote: 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And so maybe you're going up the trail on a search and rescue and you've called for the helicopter, but you have that wheeled litter team going up the trail with you, because weather might change that helicopter, might have to divert or cancel, and then you already have a backup plan, established. So I think it really taught me to be autonomous as a paramedic. And, that's why I like working in a rural and remote area, because you get to use that whole algorithm of your protocol. Sometimes in a city, you barely have time to start an IV, whereas out here on, say, an allergic reaction, you get to do it all, epi, Benadryl, Solumedrol, maybe do a breathing treatment. So you really get to practice medicine, and the protocols are a lot wider, I should say. I could relocate a dislocated shoulder at Yosemite, or, we recently got ultrasound on the ambulance here in Jackson, and, we're kind of have a blood program coming together. So it's fun. It's kind of like a little bit of Indiana Jones meets 911 in a city type of thing.
Where are you located? Do you have a central station? Are you doing 24 hours, or are you on an ambulance for a shorter amount of time?
In Jackson, we have two staff stations, and we do a lot of cross staffing because we're a smaller department. So if it's an engine call or a fire, we all hop on the engine and grab a tender, which carries like 3,000 gallons of water because some of the areas aren't hydranted. If it's a medical call in town, two will hop on the ambulance. Four hop on the engine, and so we kind of just bounce around for now. But as Jackson grows, we'll probably get away from that cross staffing and just staff each apparatus, which kind of reduces turnout time and those sorts of things. So it's kind of like a big chess game out here with limited folks, and we're a combination department, so we have a lot of volunteers as well. So it's kind of balancing what the call is, who do you take on the call, who do you leave back at station, what apparatus do you take, that whole thing. So it's a big chessboard, and maybe there's like a transport to the level 2 trauma center, which is 2 hours away, and maybe half the crews or two members of the crew are on that. So every day is different, and it's always a challenge.
What about accessibility? How are you able to get to some of these patients if you just simply can't drive the ambulance straight to them?
Well, we do have a great search and rescue team here, Teton County Search and Rescue. So they, many times they'll bring the patient to us, and they recently got a helicopter, so they have short haul capabilities. So they can do that. However, I have jumped on like various snowmobiles to get to the patient, and in Yellowstone or Yosemite, a lot of times I was on the ambulance, but I'd also join the search and rescue team. So, running up the trail to get to the patient with like a wheeled litter. So I did that a few times. And I'm currently working with Air Idaho Rescue as a critical care paramedic on the helicopter. So that's another way to reach the patient.
So let's talk about animals then. Obviously, we don't have, for example, gouging by buffalo in downtown Anaheim. So what are some of the, again, idiosyncrasies in the call? What are some of the animal-related traumas that you attend?
Yeah, out here, I kind of say the environment's always a factor, and it's maybe the environment is affecting your patient, and they have hypothermia or heat exhaustion, or maybe the environment's affecting the call in that you want to call for a helicopter, but the weather doesn't support it. And then, of course, there's the animals. And so in a national park, what I learned is like people will get as close to the animals as you let them. And, I think they just don't know. Maybe they watch too much Disney, but they will try to pet the bison. There's been cases of tourists like putting their 3-year-old on the back of a bison. So there was 5 bison gorings my last year at Yellowstone. Also did a motorcyclist versus a bison, because the bison's eyes don't really reflect like a deer, and so they're hard to see when you're driving at night. There was a grizzly bear fatality at Yellowstone. I wasn't on that. And then recently, just about 2 weeks ago, we had a double grizzly bear attack, which I was on. And another motorcyclist versus a pronghorn antelope. So it definitely happens. And yeah, it's always a challenge. We've wanted to land a helicopter, but the bison won't get off the helipad. So just, you have to have the mentality of like being able to adapt and overcome and compartmentalize and just make it work, improvise. So my wife and I teach wilderness medicine here in Jackson. And a lot of wilderness medicine is just obviously patient assessment and treatment, but just being able to improvise with what you have, make, what you need with what you have and just kind of making it work. So it's a good skill if you're working in a remote area.
One of the very first things we're taught in EMT school is scene safety. What, again, are the idiosyncrasies when, for example, you just had a grizzly attack? You're trying to get to the patient, but it's not like PD comes and secures the scene like they would in the urban setting.
Yeah. The most recent attack, the search and rescue team brought the patient to us. So we landed in a field, and then park rangers got to the patient, and then the short haul team extracted the patient. So, I know the rangers who made first contact with the patient, they had their guns drawn, and they probably obviously would have shot on sight if the bear was still there and acting in like a predatory manner. So I didn't see that, but a friend of mine, Ed, who ran a bear attack, this guy heard his dog barking, and he went out behind his house, and turns out there was a dead moose, and so the bear attacked the guy. But then the bear didn't want to leave the moose carcass. So when my buddy was trying to get to the patient, they had to have an armed guard at the front and back of the gurney, just because the bear was still in the area. So that's just kind of some of the stuff you don't typically obviously see in a city. But I think scene safety, like maybe your patient is sort of on a steep embankment and your first tendency is just to run down after him, but you might want to just pause, take a breath, and then do a quick access rope system to get to him. Just, you don't want to become a patient yourself, obviously. And so out here, just having an awareness of the environment. Another call I went on was 3 hot air balloons crashed. They got caught in like a storm cell and a downdraft. And so we responded to this open field for them here in Jackson, and there was still lightning in the area. So we went in, but we were at least mindful of what was going on. And it's like, hey, lightning's in the area, so let's try to get in and get out as fast as we can. So just having that awareness. And I think, like you say, we say it so often, scene safety, that we're kind of like numb to it, but I had to sort of relearn that working out here.
What are some of the common denominators as far as the factors that get a lot of these people in trouble in the first place in these national parks?
Sometimes I think it's just bad luck, like with the grizzly attacks, because my most recent book is about grizzly bears, just because I'm fascinated with them. But, some hikers can be hiking through the woods and a bear could just be nearby on a carcass, a bison, an elk, and that's just like bad timing, and the bear charges. So some of that you can't really avoid. You could even have bear spray, but the bear is just so fast at certain times. So that's one subset. But the other subset is just people not really thinking and approaching the bison or approaching the grizzly bears because they think they're friendly or wanting that selfie with the bison. So there is sort of that ignorance or people forgetting that they are wild animals. Or, in Yosemite, when I worked there, there's a lot of waterfalls and, people are just climbing over the safety barriers and safety gates to get that picture right on the edge of the waterfall. And, sometimes they get swept in. So it's pretty sad, those calls, because it's all just preventable. If they just stayed behind the little fence, the picture's just as good, but people try to push the envelope.
One of my friends, when I told him I was interviewing you, had 2 things for me to ask you. I guess the first one probably ties into what you just said. He mentioned there'd been a lot of disappearances in Yellowstone. Talk to me about that.
There have been a lot of disappearances in the national parks. I hadn't necessarily heard that it's Yellowstone specific. Your friend might have more info than I. And then there's a great book that just came out. I'm blanking on the title right now, but Andrea Langford She is a former park ranger, and she write Trail of the Lost. That's what it's called. Um, so that's a wonderful book, a bestseller, and she's just talking about people who get lost in national parks and on like the Pacific Crest Trail. And yeah, there's a lot, and some are unexplained. Some they think, maybe it was intentional that they wanted to sort of disappear. We have had a few folks in Yellowstone and Grand Teton who have gone missing. As I talk about it, I remember more. Um, and so it's hard to know, maybe they fell in just a place that can't be seen by air, and, potentially animals predate on the carcass, kind of. So there's no like exact answer why they've disappeared, but it does happen. I'd say maybe one case every couple years. But generally, they are able to find the body, and we do a all out effort to locate the body, but sometimes we can't.
What about on the criminal side? I know that, for example, there's been cases where someone has done some horrible stuff, and they're survivalists, and they go hide in a national park, and they're eventually taken, but they kill a police officer in the process. Are there any kind of notable cases that you can remember, maybe during your time there, where there was crimes committed in these national parks?
Yeah, I guess the highest profile one here in the Grand Teton was the Gabby Petito case, which you might be. She was on kind of living in a van with her boyfriend, and thousands of followers. There's a Netflix documentary, but he returned home without her, and so the Instagram followers, I think they sounded the alarm first, and they're just like, he's back home, and where is she? And um, th- he ended up murdering her in Grand Teton, and so that was a really high profile case here, and a big search, and kind of putting the clues together. And a lot of it was, I think campers had recognized the van that they saw in Grand Teton, and so helped the authorities. So that was probably the biggest one. And in Yellowstone, when I was there wasn't necessarily a big case like that, but there was at the time supposedly this treasure buried in Yellowstone, um, with millions of dollars, and so there was these people looking for the treasure, and they just venture into the backcountry not equipped. They get on the Yellowstone River in like a inner tube. It's not even allowed, let alone they don't even have a raft. And so a lot of those would like end up as search and rescues that, the rangers would go on. I think maybe 2 years ago, there was an active shooter situation in Yellowstone in the Canyon District. And, that he had a plan, and, luckily the Rangers kind of neutralized the threat before he carried it out. But the part that basically things like that teach me that we're in these remote national parks, but people don't leave their comorbidities at home when they visit. Criminals still visit. So even though it's remote, you still always got to have your guard up. And some of the same problems you see in the city, they appear in national parks as well. Like Charles Manson, for instance, the serial killer in, I don't know, the 60s or 70s, they found him hiding out in Death Valley. So all types are drawn to the outdoors, for various reasons. And sometimes they're not, people want to hide or, hide from the law and that sort of thing.
He's probably like, how did you find me? I'm like, well, everyone said there's a guy with a swastika on his forehead over there. It's pretty easy to figure out where you were at the end. All right. Another thing he asked me to ask you about, Bigfoot. Not a topic I normally talk about, but I mean, obviously there's the folklore, but is there any kind of what would be the right word, theories from the people that actually work in there as to whether it's real or whether there are animals that are being mistaken for Bigfoot?
I didn't really hear of Bigfoot too much here. I tend to think of that as sort of like a Pacific Northwest kind of Sasquatch thing. And, you can go either way. I have heard they're just mistaking something, sort of in like the Himalayas. Maybe it's like the Himalayan black bear that they're mistaking, but, then there's others that have proof or believe the other way. So I don't know. I like the idea of Bigfoot, but I have yet to encounter Bigfoot in the wild. Um, Part of the thing out here is we're so concerned with grizzlies, So I think that's our main concern and worry that you know Bigfoot is almost like less scary to encounter versus a grizzly out here.
I was talking to my son the other day about the people that believe that the earth is flat. And I was telling him, honestly, I don't care either way. Like, I've got real world problems. If it's flat, it's flat. And if it's round, it's round. I
Right,
think it's round. That's what a lot of people that, go to space tell us. But the reality is, it doesn't really have any bearing on our day to day life either way. And it's kind of like you're talking about with Bigfoot. Okay, it is real. It's not real, but these grizzlies are definitely real. So let's focus on
right.
that.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting. There's a place in Yellowstone called the Thoroughfare, and I think the author C.J. Box wrote about it. But because Yellowstone's in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, but there's this one small part of the park where it's like the jurisdictions they overlap or don't overlap in such a way that you could actually murder someone there and get away with it because there's no one who actually has jurisdiction over that area. So he wrote a book about it, and there's just all these unique things about national parks. These little known secrets, or you know, they excite your imagination. Whether it's Bigfoot or people disappearing or this thoroughfare area where you could commit murder if you wanted to. It's interesting.
That's a perfect segue because I was going to ask you if the show Yellowstone has had any impact on the actual area. And there is an area where they dump all the bodies that I'm maybe assuming that it's based on that. This kind of non-jurisdiction place where no one's going to be looking for them. But it was a very, very popular show. Have you seen any ripple effect in the real world from that fictional show?
Yeah, I think it's sort of glamorized going west again, the westward expansion. And, you know, there's a lot more cowboy hats walking around Jackson Hole than there was. And people are just excited about it and excited about the outdoors and Montana and Bozeman and whatnot. And, and for good reason, because it's beautiful. And, like Taylor Sheridan's newest show, The Madison, is all about fly fishing. And so I think that'll have kind of a ripple effect that, people see the show and they want to learn to fly fish. So, I think it has changed it, a lot more visitors. But the show was kind of right on as far as what's going on with development. And, do you protect the old way, or do you develop? And if you develop, what's lost, culturally or environmentally? And so the debate he talks about is definitely going on out here. But I think, yeah, his shows capture people's imagination and they want to come out here, and it's a great, beautiful place to live. So, yeah.
What about the indigenous populations, the Native American tribes, etc.? Again, they're telling that story on that show, but it is even to this day. We talk about certain, groups that are marginalized. Usually, it's toward African American or Hispanic, but this is like the, the elephant in the room. Hello, we were the ones that you took the country from in the first place. Do you encounter, those populations in the work that you do at the moment?
I do a little bit, working on the helicopter, because sometimes we'll fly into like the Wind River Range or the Wind River Reservation near Lander, Wyoming. And so, I've transported patients from the reservation, and I think they definitely have their challenges. And, they have the land, but there's not a lot of opportunity there. So it's a hard place. So we've supported them on one hand and given them the land, but then we haven't supported them that there's not great medical facilities in their communities. There's not a lot of great jobs. So it's challenging to see that, in the same way, like certain pockets of the inner city, it's just surrounded by like liquor stores and fast food and, just it's hard to break out of those communities because you're just surrounded by negative stuff, whether it's alcohol or fast food, just stuff's bringing you down, lack of jobs, that sort of thing. So you see some of that on the reservation.
I hear this a lot about reservations all over the US and even Canada, and when you think about one of the challenges that we have in our profession, as we transition out, it's a loss of tribe, loss of identity. And if you think about a lot of the Native American, indigenous tribes around the world that literally had their tribe almost wiped from the face of the earth, they had the schoolhouses and all these other things. Think about the generational trauma that causes, that you're not just, moved to somewhere else, but you retain your identity and everything. Your children are literally reprogrammed to forget everything that you were before. So, it's no wonder that there's this ripple effect of domestic abuse and, addiction and some of these other things that we hear. Because, if it's detrimental to a soldier or a firefighter just to leave their tribe of a station or a unit, imagine having your entire identity smited from the earth.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, definitely a lot of challenges there. And I guess one thing we were talking, I used to, when I was early in the profession, I would say, a firefighter is not what I do, it's who I am. But as I've gotten older and evolved, at least on my journey, now I'm back to saying it's what I do, but it's not who I am. And so, because when you leave the profession, it can be hard if you only identify as the profession. Now, I would say, like, I am a first responder. Like, my nature is to help others and to serve my community. But I guess I say less that, I don't say anymore, it's not a job I do, it's who I am, because there's other things we could do, that have meaning and value and whatnot. And so I think that's kind of how I've evolved. And I think it's actually a good journey because, you see some people that, I kind of linked up with this thought through like some military podcasts where guys were having trouble leaving the service, whether it's Navy SEAL or pararescue, because that's all they identify themselves with. And sort of the podcast was saying that, these guys have tons of talents and there's many things they can do, and, kind of just teaching them that. And that's kind of helped their transition into other things. So anyways, that's kind of how I view my journey now, I guess.
I couldn't agree more. I've reframed the way I think about it, and especially this transition, which I had no anticipation of leaving the fire service. It was literally the environment, and burying my friends that drove me out to try and fix it from the outside. But it's not who I am. It's what I do because of who I am. And that's a different thing. And going back to your childhood, you were raised to be kind and that spirit of service. This is just one of the uniforms that you and I are wearing during these chapters in our life. But the mission has always been to help people.
Yeah, no, you said it the way I was trying to say it. So I appreciate that. But yeah, no, and there's many ways to serve and help others, so maybe like you say, one chapter it's as a firefighter, and the next it's as a flight paramedic. And then maybe after that, it's as an instructor or a writer, a podcast host. So that's a great way of looking at it.
So as you reflect back to this portion of your career, you've obviously hit on some of the animal related calls that you've been on. What have been some of the other career calls that you encountered during this portion of your journey?
Yeah, I think, the 3 hot air balloons that crashed, and, there's like, I think 38 people on the balloons. And luckily, the balloons kind of hit and they were dragged versus like falling from the sky, So I think we only had about maybe 11 patients and everyone survived. But calls like that, some paragliding accidents, had a few of those. Um, you know, Out here, an MCI it might be like 3 or 4 patients just because, we only have 2 staffed ambulances and then we got a call for the Grand Teton ambulances. So I guess there's different definitions of MCI and like career calls based on where you are. But it's also not all just about the trauma, like the double bear maulings, maybe like in Wild Rescues, I wrote about this call where, this veteran who was old and probably his first and last time visiting Yellowstone, he just needed help walking out to see Old Faithful. And so, I kind of helped him back into his wheelchair and walked him out to Old Faithful. And, to me, that's like a career call because we shared that together. And my mission that day was to help him see Old Faithful. It's been like a lifelong dream. So I guess as my career evolves, I see the career calls. It's not just always the crazy triple hot air balloon. It can be just those like moments of connection and compassion as much as the crazy calls.
That's why I use the term career call, and I'm so glad that you said that because some of the big fires and some of the nasty traumas I've had, I've written about in the book, my first book, but then also a back to bed call. You go in and it's an elderly couple, and the guy is just shame on his face. He can't pick up the love of his life. She's soiled herself. And there's 4 lads that get to, take her to the bathroom, clean her up, put her in fresh clothes, put her back to bed, obviously just make sure she's all right medically. And that's it. That's all it took, and was it in the job description? No, we don't have to clean people's, poop off them or anything, but that's the right thing to do. And that's one of the things that I look back as a career call because yes, it's very heroic being on a 3rd story, roof with a chainsaw in your hand or making entry through a window. But you make just as much as of a difference when you cheer up a child who's terrified in the back of the rig or clean up a back to bed call. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, no, it's beautifully said. And I think I seem to get a lot of like, traumatic brain injury calls. And I feel good about a few of those where I've just caught them early. Maybe it's, at Yosemite, this woman was ice skating and she hit her head and, had a brief loss of consciousness. Then she had that lucid interval. And then we got to her and she kind of started that downward spiral. So having caught some of those TBIs early and called for the right resources and, it always feels good to do the job well. And a lot of times the calls aren't life and death, but it feels great when it is life and death and you and your crew rise to the challenge and, you do really make a difference. And so, yeah, one thing I say is when I teach, it's like there are the patients who will live regardless, the patients who will die regardless, and the patients you can save. So like that broken ankle, they'll live regardless. Patients who will die regardless, maybe it's just trauma that's not survivable. But then that middle group, those you can save. And so a lot of the career calls fall into that realm where you do actually make a huge difference and, save a life.
I've talked about this a few times. I just had a Black Cloud Grim Reaper paramedic career, and I literally have 0 code saves. I'm just that shit magnet that gets the GI bleeds and the AAAs and the brain bleeds and, just the diseased hearts that refuse to return no matter what you defibrillate with. And it really made me realize that there's a massive moral injury when you do everything right and they don't survive. And then you look retroactively at medic school that you and I went through. And I think there's a beautiful opportunity to do, for example, a mega code have the student go through the different rhythms, push the right drugs, use the right, electrical stimulus, and the patient not make it and say, good job, you did everything right, but this is the real world. 95% of them aren't going to make it. But every time we do an ACLS, PALS, whatever it is, you eventually get that normal sinus, ROSC, and you're going to air quotes, transport to the hospital now. And I think whether it's even in the fire side or the EMS side, I really think there's a great opportunity to weave that into some of the training, that they do every single thing right, but in that scenario, the patient still died. And that's what happens in the real world. So they're prepared for that, especially a career like mine, where, if you're just that unlucky guy and you get all these awful, codes that, as you said, they're going to die regardless, that you're not feeling like you're the worst medic in the world, because, there's some people that get the person returning to the station with a cake a week later. And there's some like me that end a 14-year career with 0 saves. I had a lot of pre-code saves. So if you were in cardiac arrest and James Gearing was your medic, you're fucked. That's the bottom line.
Sure. Right. Well, yeah, my wife and I teach PALS and ACLS, and I think I was listening to a podcast and they recommended doing what you say. And so now when I teach, I will, for each student, they might get a save on one scenario, and then the next, like you said, I'll have them do all the right treatments, but the patient, doesn't make it, which is good because that prepares them for the real world, like you say.
Absolutely. You mentioned the hot air balloon incident. Just going back for a second, what triage philosophy do you use in your environment?
Well, typically we will do, like start triage or RPM, but I think a year or two ago, there was a paper put out by Dr. Stacy Shackelford and Dr. Rush, who was the pararescue medical director, Dr. Stephen Rush, and they looked at all these MCIs. And so it's sort of an evidence-based approach on the MCIs. And the podcast that they talked about, it was PJ Med podcast, which is one of my favorites. And so what they found is like no one's using the triage tags initially. And so they recommend first pass actions prior to triage. And so, you get out there, you get your hands on patients, you apply tourniquets, maybe you open an airway, move on to the next person. So like the triage tags have a role, but maybe it's once you get to patients to the casualty collection point, so they kind of looked at what was actually working real world versus like how we train. And so I do have a lecture that I've given about the hot air balloons and about MCI triage. And it's like, here we train where we all arrive at once. We all arrive 20 minutes after the incident. Mm-hmm. We put on tourniquets, we save lives. But here in this rural area, or even a city, you're never arriving all at once with the cavalry. It's going to be a unit, then another unit. And you're not going to arrive 20 minutes after the injury and put on tourniquets and save lives because they've already like bled out, and, no one really is going to walk around with the triage tag, so basically we were training the way we thought we should train. And it's a good way to have that awareness. But this paper kind of outlines a different way to look at these incidents and, what works versus what's not really working, So the hot air balloon kind of taught me that, like patients were scattered, we didn't go around initially with the triage tags. One of the teaching points that I talk about was we were letting incident command get in the way of getting hands on patients. So like people were wanting to have this incident command set up, but there weren't enough people to set it up. And so people were waiting on the wings for incident command assignments and this and that. And like patients just weren't getting treated. So I just had to tell my captain, like, hey, we got to just get hands on the patients, So things like that, that call sort of taught me. And basically how it evolved, which this paper, I think the paper is called Time, Triage, in Transport and Mass Casualty Incidents. But basically it says in these incidents, we get there, we treat the life threats, we open the airway, slap on a tourniquet, and then we're moving patients to like a CCP. And then people are breaking out the triage tags, kind of doing that secondary triage, and then getting them go into the hospital. And so if that's what's happening real world, like that's how we should train, type of thing. So that's kind of how that hot air balloon, we got there. And again, there's always, I think there's that Mike Tyson quote, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. And so like we got there, we thought it was one balloon. We get on scene. Turns out there's 3 balloons. It's like they're in a field. Okay, we'll just drive there. But there's barbed wire fence, easily get the bolt cutters out. But then there's an irrigation ditch with water, so we can't drive. So all these sort of challenges we just had to like adapt and overcome. But yeah, so we ended up kind of doing what that paper said, getting, quickly assessing all the patients. There weren't any like arterial bleeds to treat or anything, but eventually moving the patients to like a CCP, which is right next to the road, and then doing that secondary triage and then getting them going to the hospital. If that makes sense.
No, it does. I had John Spearer on the show, who's the guy behind Fit to Fight Fire, and he was one of the first medics on scene of the Aurora shooting. And it was interesting hearing him talking about start triage because, they had people that there was tear gas thrown, I believe, or smoke at least. So, their respirations were all over the place. They came from a dark place and, it's still dark. So you're not able to assess pupils and no one's following instructions because they're terrified. So you had no way of really assessing the way that we were told to assess. And people were leaving, all kinds of different exits and getting taken by police cars. So, the original way of, okay, anyone who can stand up and go stand on the green tarp, that's, as you said, you listen to these people and I'm not one of them that were at these big events. And it really does show that there are a lot of deficiencies in some of these theories and that especially the military, obviously, there are some great, groups of people that we should be listening to what they're saying about this.
Yeah, I think if I was to respond to like an active shooting incident at, say, the grocery store, I'd be rushing in, slapping on tourniquets, and just getting people to, the front door as fast as I can, where they can meet like the ambulance. I'd just be just doing that, like down and dirty quick, slapping on tourniquets, moving patients, that sort of thing, versus like taking the time to try to go through this RPM thing. Cause like you're cognitively, you just won't be able to, I think it's just so stressful and you just got to do like the bare basics of treating those immediate life threats and then getting them moving towards the CCP in the hospital.
Absolutely. Well, you wrote your book, Wild Rescues, about this portion of your career, and now, what made you write that book specifically, and why the timing when you wrote it?
Well, I guess what I say is I'm in my books, like they're kind of memoirs, but I'm not like the hero of any of my books because I'm the one making the mistakes, missing the IVs, and so each book is like a celebration of where I was and who I was with. And so Lights and Sirens is a celebration of paramedic school and my classmates and the paramedic profession. And so I worked for the National Park Service, and I guess I was really inspired by where I was, who I was working with, and the mission of remote and wilderness medicine. So I wrote the book to celebrate that. And again, sort of like Lights and Sirens, I'm sort of the one learning wilderness medicine throughout the book. And that's actually like a pretty good tool because as I learn, the reader learns, and so, I'm kind of the one making mistakes initially, but then I kind of learned wilderness medicine. And yeah, I just wanted to celebrate the national park mission, these beautiful national parks, which many people consider America's best idea, and just also some of the challenges we face and just some of the crazy calls, the touching ones, the humorous ones, and just celebrate it all. And there's a lot of interest in wilderness medicine right now, whether it's, mountains, jungle, or even, space medicine. And with things like Hurricane Katrina, we see that sometimes even a city can become wilderness medicine when like utilities are shut off and there's flooding. So I think it's good knowledge to have if you're working in the medical field. And another thing is I love wilderness medicine because we run these tragic calls and they can deplete you, but then you're in a beautiful area. So the environment can renew you. I'm working here in the Tetons, and, like I went on that double grizzly mauling in Yellowstone just about, 2 weeks ago. And so that depleted me and was pretty, traumatic to witness. But then I was in Yellowstone 3 days later with my parents. And so the same landscape that sort of caused some of this trauma, like renewed me. And I was filled up again and inspired by watching Old Faithful and seeing the bison. And we even saw a grizzly bear while we were there. And that's the cool thing about an area like this, that the environment can re-inspire you after you run that difficult call.
It is interesting because that's what a lot of people, and I'll ask you this at the end, and when I ask what do you do to decompress, a lot of it is nature. I mean, I take my dog for a walk twice a day, and it's beautiful where I live. It's not a national park by any means, but it's, it's still gorgeous, and, birds and animals all over the place, but it is a very healing element. So I can imagine if that is your workplace, as you are encountering trauma, there's an equal and opposite benefit of, sunshine and fresh air and nature and, green bathing or whatever they call it with the woods around you. So it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think that's the final word is like the healing and the light, because I can drive through Grand Teton in Yellowstone, and pretty much every pullout or every trail, I've probably ran some type of call on there, or, most of the areas. So there's the potential to have just not want to visit these parks. But like you say, ultimately, I'm always left feeling inspired and renewed, even at the same trailhead that might have once been like a dark memory. It always ends up positive at the end.
I know there's been conversations of administrations threatening some of the environment in some of these national parks. What are you seeing through your eyes as far as the danger of some of this being, as we're going back to the Yellowstone, being sold for development, or being, Buffalo moved on, or whatever the topic is? What are you hearing and seeing through your eyes specifically?
Well, I started in Yellowstone in 2014. And so even back then, we were understaffed and everyone had collateral duties, and like the law enforcement rangers, their primary job is law enforcement, but they were being asked to do search and rescue and structure fire and wildland fire and law enforcement. And, part of that is amazing and fun, but they were also just overworked. And, I remember like I would have to leave the park on my days off because if I stayed, they'd be knocking on the door like, hey, we got a medical call, we need you. And that's not like a healthy environment, as you say, like we need that work-life balance. And so even back then we were understaffed. And so I think, over the last couple of years, when we see the cuts to the national parks, it's depleting an already depleted system. And then as far as protecting national parks, that's our one, I guess, land agency where it's just going to stay the way it is. Like the Forest Service lands, they're multi-use. You can hunt on Forest Service lands, and there's ski areas on Forest Service lands. There's logging. So I think that's cool and that has a place. But I think our national parks need to stay just pure. So, no hunting in national parks and no logging and, all that sort of thing. it's nice to have just parks that are just for our enjoyment. They're not for commerce or anything else. And I think we have a good system because there's the national parks, then there's national forest that's multi-use, and then you have like the Bureau of Land Management. So they kind of all work for different purposes. And I think the way they historically have been has worked pretty well. And every special interest group gets represented. Some people just want to enjoy the national parks, others want that mixed use of the national forest. The BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, that's kind of like anything goes out there. You can just camp wherever you want type of thing. So I think it's a pretty good system, but it's a delicate system, and we should definitely protect our national parks.
Absolutely. Well, your latest book is Grizzly Confidential. You talked obviously about the attacks that you responded to. What are some of the myths about grizzlies? What are some of the lessons that people need to know if they happen to either deliberately not encounter or, God forbid, encounter a grizzly on a bad day?
Well, I wrote the book because there are obviously grizzlies in this area, and I've always been fascinated by them. Whether it's their strength and speed or just their hibernation physiology. As a paramedic, it's like bears put on all this weight in the fall, but they don't get diabetes. They can like turn their insulin sensitivity on and off like a light switch. And when they hibernate, they also don't lose muscle mass. So like NASA is very interested in brown bear physiology because the minute the astronauts go up into space, they start losing muscle mass, whereas bears don't. They also put on all this weight and they don't get coronary artery disease. So there's this idea that maybe some of these human afflictions can be solved by grizzly bear physiology, which is super interesting. So I've been interested in grizzlies, but when I started living amongst them, I realized that I was also like terrified of them. And so with Lights and Sirens, I learned this quote that the best way out is through. And it's a good quote, whether you're a firefighter or an artist or terrified of grizzlies. So I was fascinated, but also terrified. So I embarked on this journey to learn everything I could about them, to see, if I could understand them and how we coexist with grizzly bears. So each chapter is at a different location and kind of is a different lens through which to view grizzly bears. And so one chapter I go to Washington State University where they're doing some of that brown bear physiology research. Another chapter I went to Kodiak Island, Alaska, and I went on a brown bear hunt. And that chapter is all about how hunting can also serve conservation. People typically think it's opposite of conservation, but hunters historically have been some of our best conservationists. So that's kind of like what the book's about. It's making the science of grizzly bears interesting, and the book's kind of like an adventure quest. So it's adventure, but some science about grizzly bears.
So for people that are faced with one, because this is always the thing, do you punch a shark in the nose? Do you poke a bear in its eyes? Do you run? Do you play dead? What were the lessons that you were learning from some of these experts as far as how to try and avoid being attacked in the first place? And if they do suddenly rear up on the hind legs, what should the average not bear expert do in that situation?
Yeah, great questions. So folks should realize that in the lower 48, the grizzlies are present in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and that's pretty much it. So historically, they used to be in a bunch of the western states, but then, we kind of eradicated them. So just in those 3 states right now, they might reintroduce them to the North Cascades of Washington. But I teach a grizzly bear defense class, which is coming up on May 30th. And so I'll give you the quick version, but basically bears have a great sense of smell and their eyesight is not the best. So when a bear stands, it's actually trying to get is trying to get a better scent or a sight of you. So that's kind of what they're doing. They're very curious. Um, it's when the bear is sort of, exhibiting signs of stress that you should worry. When it's like huffing or clacking its jaw or swaying its head and salivating, with its head real low. Those are all like signs of stress. Bears are also, they're always measuring the like caloric return from the energy expended. So if they can walk on a hiking trail and it expends less energy than kind of barreling through the woods, they'll take the trail. So expect to see bears on the trail, but just because a bear's walking on the trail doesn't mean it's coming after you. So prevention is the best medicine. I like that quote for bears and a lot of other things. So with bears and grizzlies, you want to ideally hike in a group. You want to make noise. You want to carry bear spray. You want to try to avoid hiking at dawn and dusk when bears are most active. So that's like the best case. But, maybe I want to go trail running and no one's free. So I'm sort of like driving a car. There's the best practices, but if you're driving without your seatbelt, your risk level goes up, or you're speeding, your risk level. So if I'm going to go for a trail run in Grand Teton by myself, I'm kind of ramping up the risk. So then I'll try to eliminate it by maybe I'm running in like a trail that is more open so I can see more. And I like to bring a little speaker and kind of blast some music. So I'm making noise, and I got my bear spray and like a chest rig or something like that. So those are some of the best practices. And then as far as brown bears and grizzlies, they're the same species. So there's typically this saying that if it's black, fight back. If it's brown, lay down. And so a black bear, if it's coming after you, it's a predatory attack. So you want to fight back. So if it's black, fight back. Because black bears, they evolved in the forest. So their natural tendency is to run or climb a tree. So if a black bear is aggressive, fight back. Now, if it's brown, lay down. That's only 50% true. So with grizzly bears, there's the defensive attack and then the predatory attack. So if it's defensive, like a mother with cubs or a bear is on a food source or a surprise encounter, you do want to use your bear spray. But if the bear makes contact, play dead, lie face down, cover your neck, keep your backpack on, because you're showing the bear you're not a threat. So whatever it's defending, its food, its cub, ideally it'll just kind of walk away. Now, very rarely you'll have a grizzly predatory attack. And so that's a bear comes into camp and it's a predatory bear. And so in that case, you want to fight back. So if it's brown, lay down, it's only if it's a defensive attack. And so we've had a couple instances out here over the last probably 15 years where a grizzly came into a campground and, killed a person. Another time, this woman was on a bike trip in Montana and a predatory grizzly came in. And so in that case, you would want to fight back. So if that makes sense. So if it's a surprise encounter and it's a defensive attack, use your bear spray. If it makes contact, play dead. But if it's a grizzly or a black bear coming into your camp and acting predatory, you want to fight back, make noise, whatever you can do to deter that attack. So that's the quick, my class is like 4 hours. And we even have a charging grizzly bear prop. And so I teach the bear spray section. And so I have people just practice deploying it, but then you're never just waiting for a bear. So then I'll have them tie their shoe or jog in place, and then I'll yell deploy, because that's like real world. You'll be doing something else, hiking, your mind will be wandering, then you'll have to like deploy. So that's kind of how we practice.
So you need to stop the bear and ask it for its intentions first, and then either fight or fall down.
Yeah, basically. But yeah, in the class, I show a lot of videos of like bears that are stressed. And then I show bears that aren't stressed, like a little black bear walking down the trail. So people can kind of see the difference and learn the signs of when a bear is stressed and when a bear is not stressed. So yeah, it's fun. I enjoy it. And then I also do a little stop the bleed at the end of the class just to throw that in there. So
What are some stories of people that have fought back? Because I mean, obviously there's some pretty horrendous injuries of some people that have encountered it, but what are some of the folklore of humans that have survived a very deliberate predatory attack?
well, I guess most recently in Cody, Wyoming, there was two high schoolers who are like on the wrestling team, and supposedly a bear started attacking this guy's friend, and so his buddy jumped on the bear's back and fought off the bear. So that's the way the newspaper reported it. I'm not quite sure what exactly went on, but that's sort of like the folklore. But based on the books I've read, if it's a defensive attack, you're not going to win versus a grizzly. So fighting back is not, it'll just encourage the bear to act more aggressive and to keep the fight going. Whereas if you play dead, you know, you could get seriously injured, but the bear does tend to leave, the vicinity fairly quickly.
And then last bear question, then we'll move on to something
Yeah.
else. But what about running? How fast are these bears?
They can run up to 35 miles an hour. And so they
Oof.
say if you see a bear, don't run because you're mimicking prey. And then you also can't outrun the bear. So the minute you see a bear, don't run, make some noise, try to deter it, and then just get your bear spray ready. And, most times the bear will just run away because it's more afraid of you. But yeah, running definitely won't work.
Brilliant. All right.
Yeah.
Well, transitioning that you touched on it a little bit as far as, this recent bear attack and, that rocking you for a few days as well. It should have. Talk to me about peer support, the team that you're on and how that works in your world.
Yeah. I guess the lesson there is, this bear attack that I was on, I, you never know which call is going to throw you for a loop. And so my resilience, I'd say, is really strong, having been a paramedic for 15 years. But that call threw me for a loop. And I think it was because I love grizzly bears so much. And I wrote this book on them. And then suddenly I saw just the suffering that a bear can cause. So that threw me for one loop. And then also just my relationship with the outdoors was, I don't know, it was affected because, I trail run, I mountain bike, I ski, and now I've just seen proof that these grizzly bears can be super dangerous. And while I knew it, I hadn't really seen it in front of me. And so that call was harder than some of the other calls, due to the patient's injuries and due to my relationship with bears and also the outdoors. So with difficult calls, you don't always know which one's going to hit you hardest until after the fact. And one thing we have out here, which is cool, is called the Teton Interagency Peer Support Group. So the TIPS team, and basically all the public safety agencies out here have gotten together, and police, search and rescue, Jackson Hole Fire, Grand Teton National Park. Each agency has like 2 or 3 folks who are part of the peer support team. And, if anyone needs to talk to someone else, sometimes you don't always want to talk to someone in your agency. So, I can chat with someone from search and rescue, and we're first responders helping first responders. And we found that the public is really supportive of this. And so raising money has been really easy. And so with the money we have in the bank, people can get free counseling. And it's also like wider than that. So it's like whatever you need to heal. And so maybe like my friend, he ran a difficult call, pediatric cardiac arrest, and he just wanted a massage, maybe get some of that trauma, the idea of like muscle memory. And so that's what he wanted. And so we paid for the massage. And, maybe someone else wants just a night out with their spouse. So the tips program can cover the babysitter. So I think it's really cool how it's, you know, counseling and therapy is part of it, but it's also like wider, whatever will help you heal. Um, and so we have that program, and then we've like normalized the conversation about operational stress. And so responderalliance.com, this woman, Laura McGladley, she kind of runs this, I guess, peer support program. And so there's like the stress continuum, red is, it goes from green, yellow, orange, red. And so it's kind of that continuum of stress where you're at. And so we've normalized that conversation here in the Tetons. And so some captains at Jackson Hole Fire, they'll start each shift saying like, where are you, James? And you can just say, hey, I'm orange today. And you don't have to say why, but so we kind of all know where we're at on the stress continuum. But also like another good thing is like, which way are you facing? So like if I'm orange because I got finals and I've been working 48s, but I'm facing green because I'm going to Cabo tomorrow, is a lot different than, hey, I'm orange, but I'm getting divorced and I'm facing red, so you find out what color you are, but also which way you're facing. And so I think it's just cool that we've normalized that where no one has to explain. You can say, hey, I'm green today, I'm orange, I'm yellow. And so the tips program, but also just like the normalization of the job that we do as being hard and stressful, and just that support is amazing. And so I like to mention that just because it's worked so well. And then just fundraising has been super easy. So I feel like this similar programs could expand to other parts of the country and help out first responders as well.
I love that for a couple of reasons. I love the color one. I've heard people mention that before because I can think, earlier in my career, how when someone came in a pissy mood, the prevalence was that we would just start pushing buttons and it would make it worse. But if you're saying, hey, which was me, absolutely me, I'm just found out that, this has happened with my wife, and, now my marriage is going to take, and I'm a single dad, and like, don't start messing with my computer and putting silly pictures up because, my tolerance has gone from 100 to 0.16. So the chances of getting punched in the face are very, very high right now, even if it's coming from a more innocent place. So I think that's great. And I love the way you talk about facing. I also love the fact that you talked about, other holistic ways of just decompressing, whether it's a babysitter or a massage, because not everyone needs to sit down and talk to someone. They just just need to turn off their phone and just be present with their kids or whatever it is, and just spend a day or two, letting that go. So I think that's brilliant. I love the way that you look at that.
Yeah, so I've been a representative of Jackson Hole Fire, and we can attend, like coaching sessions, and we can learn how to be a better peer support member for folks who might call us and need to talk and that sort of thing. So I guess the good thing is now versus when I started as a paramedic is there is that awareness, and podcasts like this are so helpful and offering solutions to stay resilient, whether it's the new work week or whether it's physically or sleep hygiene or peer support groups. So it's cool that there's that awareness, and also like these answers that helps us all stay resilient.
Absolutely. That's why I love this medium. Doesn't matter where you are on the planet. If you understand English, then you can apply this to your own department. And it could be in Nepal, it could be, Kyoto, wherever. And I think it's amazing. There's zero barrier to entry in the podcast world. We also talked before we hit record about aging. And this is, I think, an important conversation, because who you and I were, even though we started late, I was 27, you were early 30s, are very different than, late 40s, 50s. So talk to me about that whole philosophy through your eyes.
Yeah, I thought it was important to bring up just because I think, you know, it's important to acknowledge that you change as you get older. You change physically, your sleep changes, your resilience changes, nutrition. And so I've seen and I've, witnessed some of the downsides of when people's say mentality doesn't change and they're picking up OT, when they're in like mid 50s, the same way they were when they were 21, and, we had like a cardiac arrest during a pack test. Are you familiar with the pack test? It's basically
Yeah,
for
the
a while.
wildland rug.
Yeah. So we had a cardiac arrest, and luckily, our captain survived. We got an AED on him super quick and one shock, and he was back. But I think it's important to know that as you get older, maybe you can't pick up the overtime. It's that things change and your resilience changes, and so it's good to be mindful of that. And I guess from my own example, I love firefighting, but I'm 51 now, and over the last year or so, I just noticed that when I was climbing a ladder, you know, getting way up there, for some reason I was a little more anxious than I was previously, and going on air, my mask, just wanting to pull it off, getting in that red zone. And so I just acknowledge it that like, hey, this is where I'm at. And, to be honest, I don't feel like physically I'm there for myself, but also like my crew members. And so that's kind of why I made the jump to go full time as a flight paramedic. And I also love the medicine side of it. But just being aware of those subtle changes. And, I think it's important to try to stay ahead of the curve. So you have that awareness. So you do it before you get injured, or you do it before, something happens when you're, in that ideal age. So I guess one thing I did well was I kind of listened to those whispering voices before it became an issue, whether it was, me not feeling comfortable on a roof, now that I'm in my 50s, or, wanting to tear my mask off, I'm like, hey, if I'm doing this during training, that's not a good spot to be in. So just, trying to stay proactive on those things, just so like, just trying to make sure like folks don't get hurt or don't hurt their crew members. And I think if you have that awareness that as you get older, things change, you can kind of stay ahead of it before, like, because I think there's this quote basically like, what we don't listen to comes back to us as fate, kind of like if you don't listen to that little voice, it's going to reappear as an accident down the road, something like that. So I just thought I'd throw that out because it's easy. When I play basketball, my mind still thinks I'm 18, even though my body's 51. And I think it's true in firefighting. Your mind still thinks, you're 21, on the nozzle, but you've aged a lot since then when you're in your 50s. So just being mindful of those changes.
Yeah. Firstly, you are literally the first person I've met that's as bad at remembering quotes as I am. So I'm glad we're kindred spirits. I butcher quotes like every time I try and think, a bird in the hand is worth two badgers in a basket or something. I can't remember now.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the aging thing. I mean, I transitioned out almost 8 years ago now. I'm 52. So I was 44 when I left. So I didn't get to experience, the last few years. But going back to it's not who I am, it's what I do. What I think is beautiful, you've done this in the helicopter, I've done this, in the podcast, we've both done this writing, is as you progress through a career, you don't get 50-year-old riflemen in the Marines, or at least I wouldn't have thought you would. You're still progressing up, and it might be through the chain of command, or it might be transitioning out of the military and using those skills in a completely different capacity. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. Do you want to just be sitting in one seat the same way as you did when you were 22? Or do you want to take all those calls and experience and apply it in a force multiplier way so that you can affect lots of people now. So I think you can promote, of course, and be in charge of a rig or a station or a battalion or whatever, or you can, either within or outside the fire service, use that experience, use that wisdom, not have to rely on getting beaten up 24 hours after 24 hours after 24 hours. Let the younger people do that thing. And now you take all that experience and become a mentor in whatever shape or form that looks like. So it's not being weak. I think it is resilience. It's wisdom. It's maturity. It's that journeyman, journey. And so, yeah, I really love that. I struggled with the ego thing a little bit when I first left, but I left for this very specific reason. There's, if a lot of people in uniform can't talk about the things that need to be talked about because they will have a bullseye on their back and their
Sure.
career will be stifled then. So I got to do that, and so how many first responders am I going to help? How many of you help with your books? And then obviously with the helicopter work that you're doing now, that's a very niche profession that you can't go through medic school and go immediately on the helicopter. You have to have that experience too. So I think it's a very
Yeah.
mature way of looking at our profession. I really do.
Well, thanks. And yeah, I mean, I'm inspired by people like you and other mentors I have. And so it's cool. It's like you say, a rising tide lifts all boats. So I think you
Absolutely.
make, you make your decisions and you inspire me to make my decisions. And then, yeah, I guess, that's why I love podcasts and reading books and going to conferences, just lots of wisdom out there.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to hit one more area, then we'll go to some closing questions, so be mindful of your time. But you make this
Sure.
transition now to critical care paramedic. Now you're in the back of, this airframe. What, again, are some of the idiosyncrasies that you have in your world now that you didn't have in all these roles you held prior?
Yeah, I guess working on the ambulance in rural and remote medicine out here, I was kind of taught. I was basically programmed to like BLS on scene, ALS en route, because our transport times are so long that we gotta just get moving towards the hospital, and I can do everything in the ambulance. Whereas the helicopter I'm on, it's an A star, and once we got that patient all bundled up, I can hardly get access to them. So I'm kind of having to relearn that and basically get everything, maybe stay a little bit longer on scene with advanced life support and the critical care side of things. And then, because once you get in the helicopter, it's noisy. I can hardly reach the patient. So I'm kind of having to relearn that whole side of things. So like the, pre-hospital trauma life support is like get off scene within 10 minutes. And we try to keep it moving, but I guess on the helicopter, um, you know, since you don't have access, you might have to spend a little bit more time on scene. But I always say that the more I practice, as the years go by, I'm just reminded how much that great basic life support care really helps. That it's not maybe, it's just those foundational treatments really do save a lot of lives. Like if you're not doing good chest compressions, the epi is not going to circulate, or if, you're pushing these meds, but you don't have that tourniquet on tight enough. And so the importance of just great basic life support is that foundational care. And on the helicopter, I'm enjoying learning like critical care side of things. And just these patients are so sick that, you're having to think of multiple things at once. And maybe one med helps one thing, but it's causing this side effect. So then you got to use this other med to help that side effect. And it's a lot of just balancing different medications and different treatments. And, like basically you need all this sedation to sedate your patient, but then the blood pressure's tanking. So now you got to add a vasopressor on there. So it's really interesting to me, and I'm kind of like a medical nerd. So I'm just loving learning each patient. I'm learning, something. It's maybe a clinical presentation I haven't seen before, or maybe I get to use a medication I haven't used before. So I'm really enjoying it. And, even the IFTs, the description I like is they call them like four-walled scene calls. So it is maybe from a small little rural hospital to a trauma center, but that little rural hospital, it's almost like a scene because they have very limited resources. And so even the IFTs, I really enjoy. And, I think this is probably I still volunteer with Jacksonville Fire EMS, but I think this is probably my last position, and then I'll get into education full time. My wife and I run a wilderness medicine business here, and probably do write some more books. But like you say, find different ways to serve. But I see myself as in education. You know, I don't plan on retiring. I just love what I do. So I definitely get a few more years running calls. Maybe till mid 50s or so, and then probably teach full time and write books and that sort of thing.
One more quick question. What can ground paramedics do to set you guys up for success on the helicopter side?
Well, the ground teams we work with, I often say they have the hardest job. Like just last week, we went on a call for a motorcyclist who fell on a highway going 75 with no helmet. And we got there, and the patient had 2 IVs. He was already packaged on a vacuum mattress, C-collar. So we had the easy job on the helicopter. They did all the hard part. But I think number one, just knowing when to call us. And we never mind launching and getting stood down. So when I give my wilderness medicine talk, I say, order resources early, order big, get more coming than you think. And then don't be afraid to stand the units down if you don't need them. Better to have everyone come in and cancel them than need them and not have them there. But so I think the ground units, just if there's any question, just giving us a call and launching us. And then, just that great basic life support care. If you can get access, that's awesome. And if you're able to package, that's ideal as well. But they do an amazing job. So it's always fun to work with the ground units.
Brilliant. All right. Well, the first of the closing questions. Is there a book written by someone else that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
Yeah, I guess one that came to mind it's called The Men, the Mission, and Me. And it's by this Delta Force commander. And each chapter is a bunch of, each chapter he talks about a mission, and then also like the life lesson that he learned from the mission. So it's a great book on leadership. It's also really entertaining. And I forget I know his name. I think his name's like Peter Blader, but the book's called The Men, the Mission, and Me. And obviously I love like Jocko, Extreme Ownership. I think that's a great book as well.
Absolutely. What about TV, documentaries, or films that you love?
I love Jimmy Chin's films, and he lives here in Jackson. And so he did Free Solo and Meru, which is a great mountaineering documentary. And then he did The Rescue, about the Thai cave rescue. So I love his films because they blend adventure, but also like some great heroic stories mixed in with the adventure.
Absolutely. I just had a female stunt woman who's a skydiver, a base jumper, and she, in the moment, I think, is doing a Jimmy Chin documentary. I think he's got a bunch of different like extreme sports people, and I'm not exactly sure the through line of it, but I believe that's his latest project.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I want to hear more about your work as a stuntman at some point.
It's not that impressive. It was good. It was fun, but yeah, nothing extreme like some of these guys. Right. All right. Well, then the next question, is there a person that you recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Yeah. Well, I know you've had Kevin Hazard, who's a friend of mine, the author. I think the woman who runs Responder Alliance, she'd be great, Laura McGladrey. And I can give you her email address. But yeah, she talks about like the stress continuum, and um, I'd say her, or you could get Dr. Rush or Dr. Shackelford to talk about the new MCI triage. And then my two medical directors are great, Dr. Will Smith and Dr. AJ Wheeler here in Jackson, and they work in the emergency department, but they're also with Teton County Search and Rescue. So they've got they're notable and well known within the field of wilderness medicine, and definitely inspiring.
Beautiful. All great suggestions. Thank you very much. All right. Well, then the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you and your books. What do you do to decompress?
Well, one of my favorite books is called The Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande. And it's kind of this idea of bringing like aviation checklists into medicine, which we do now. We have our intubation checklist and our ROSC checklist. But I recommend everyone make their own checklist to how to recover from a difficult call. And so, it's like a series of steps that are like conscious that you need to do to get back on track. And so my checklist is, journaling, hang out with family and friends, hot yoga or a workout of some sort, and get outside. So that's what helps me. And maybe one call, maybe one of those things fixes everything. Maybe a more difficult call, I might have to do two things. Maybe a really difficult call, I might have to just methodically go down that checklist, kind of like you would on an intubation or something like that. But I think folks making their own checklist and just being aware of the checklist, and then when they have a difficult call, they know what steps they can take. So those are my steps that, with that bear attack, I journaled, went to yoga, met up with my parents, went to Yellowstone, got outside. So I was kind of going down that checklist after that difficult call.
Brilliant. Absolutely love that. All right. For people listening then, where can they find the books? And then are there any areas on social media they can also follow or reach out to you?
Sure. The books you can find on Amazon. And again, the paramedic memoir is called Lights and Sirens. The one about national parks is called Wild Rescues. And then the one on grizzly bears is called Grizzly Confidential. And then I am on Instagram at kevin.m.grange, and then also Facebook. And then I tell folks, hey, if you're ever in Jackson, reach out to me on social media and swing by the fire station, because I love to just meet, the first responder family. And it's always fun to give them a tour of the fire station or a t-shirt or something like that. And then, I'm all about just that firefighter, first responder family. So, I know next time I'm in Florida, I'll probably meet you for a beer or whatever it is. So that's where they can find me.
Beautiful. Well, I love skiing and snowboarding. I haven't for quite a while, but Jackson Hole is definitely one of the places I want to go one of these seasons. So I will definitely make sure I let you know if I do.
Okay, yeah, that'd be perfect.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much. It's been such an amazing conversation, everywhere from urban street medicine in LA to bear attacks and everything in between. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. It's been an honor and it's been a lot of fun. And thank you so much for having me.